demonstration of a new method of comparison, comparative or post-comparative philosophy that I am developing at the moment. And I have decided that was a demonstration of the method on the level it was at the time I have delivered the lecture. I have upgraded and developed it further since then. And I have decided to devote today's lecture not to a particular demonstration of this, how this method works on a particular case, but rather to introduce this method on its theoretical backgrounds or its theoretical model. So yeah, without further ado, I will just set my watch not to exceed the time too much. Okay. So I will be speaking between 45 and 50 minutes, and then the rest I'm looking forward to hear from you, your feedbacks and your comments and maybe some critical questions, because I'm still working on, I'm just finishing my book on this method, so I'm very eager to hear your views on it. So, but without further ado, I will now just start. Yeah, my lecture will be structured in the following way. First, I will illuminate some problems linked to the definition of very fashionable but very confused, but words that are very that are used in a very confusing ways very often, and these are the terms cross-cultural, intercultural, and transcultural. Then I will point to the significance of what I call frameworks of reference in different cultures or different theories that have been embedded in different that have been developed in different cultures and socio-linguistic regions. Then I will proceed to illuminating some problems that are connected to comparative and post-comparative approaches. I will discuss what is actually wrong with traditional comparative philosophy in my view, and also illuminate what I understand under the term post-comparative, because this is also a very fashionable term that has been used in very in a lot of different ways. This will then take me to the introducing of some of the new approaches or some of new methods that are used recently on the basis of a critical awareness of the problems linked to traditional approaches. And I will shortly, if we have time, introduce some of such methods, of new methods of comparative philosophy. And then in the end, I will also introduce the method I am developing at the moment, and which I call the transcultural post-comparative philosophical method of sublation. Okay, sublation in short. Okay, let's begin with these terms, cross-cultural, intercultural, and transcultural. There have been, as I have already mentioned, many different ways how people use these words. In Chinese, for instance, it's quite interesting because mostly all of these three terms are just translated as Kuavanhua without marking any differences between them. But in the English-speaking world, we have. You want to move this zoom pictures. Okay. Yeah. But in the English-speaking world, of course, there are differences because otherwise there wouldn't be three different terms. But different scholars also apply these three words in completely different senses. And also, if we consult some dictionaries or encyclopedia, who also make differentiate between these three terms, we can come across very different definitions. So there is a chaos guiding the space in this series of meanings. And of course, it is not my intention now to judge which connotation is better and which is more wrong, or to present my definition, which is of course the only correct one, and so on. My intention is only to tell you how I subjectively use these three words, right? And yeah, so you can understand better what I will be talking about in the later. So cross-cultural for me is research which is dealing with scholars who are working on some phenomena or objects that are part of a cultures that are different from the culture they have been born and raised into. So, for instance, every sinologist is per se, what we are doing is intercultural research, because we are all researching, we are Western scholars researching certain phenomena or entities or objects in the Chinese tradition, and also every Norwegian archaeologist, for instance, who is exploring pyramids in Egypt, is doing, of course, cross-cultural research. Well, intercultural research for me is a research that has already to do with more interactions between the two or more cultures that are involved in a particular investigation. So it has already to do something with the transfer of meanings. So intercultural research is, in my view, more tightly linked to humanities or comparative literature, comparative philosophy, also comparative historiography, and so on, right? But for instance, Fabian Heubel has enlightened me recently that actually cross-cultural and intercultural research, that it refers to the same thing, that cross-cultural is just the same kind of research that in the USA, that is intercultural research in Europe. So he thinks that cross-cultural and cross-cultural is the American term and intercultural is the European term, but they both refer to the same thing. Be that as it may, there are recently been many different critiques oriented towards traditional cross-cultural or intercultural research, and the main issue that was criticized in this regard was linked to the traditional form, to the traditional mode of understanding the notion of culture, or the concept of culture, because scholars who were dealing with these traditional modes of intercultural, cross-cultural research mostly still proceeded from a very static understanding of culture, culture as a bearer of a certain identity, of a bearer of essence. Culture is something which is unchangeable and static. So many scholars are criticizing this type of approaches. And in this debate, in these discussions, which have been happening in the last few years, many scholars started to highlight that it would be better to do transcultural research. So what is the thing? Why should transcultural research be different from traditional intercultural, cross-cultural approaches? Well, many scholars think that this prefix, trans, in the term transcultural, of course, we all know that trans this suffix refers to transcending something, to go beyond something. And Viticilius, for instance, is convinced that this suffix, and he thinks he got it from Ralph Weber, but I'm not sure if Ralph Weber is also of this opinion, that what we are transcending here is precisely this static essentialist view of culture. And because this is a very dynamic view of a culture, this new world of culture that is this transcends this old essentialist view, is of course based on a processual philosophy, which brings us to the second possible connotation of the word trans, of the prefix trans, and this is the notion of transformation, because this is a processual philosophy. Of course, both the subject as well as the object of research are being modified, are being transformed in this process, right? And then Fabian Heubel a few days ago, again, make me aware of a third possible connotation, which is allegedly very common in Germany. When they say transcultural philosophy, they don't refer to transcending something, but more to the idea of transit. So this means that in this German understanding of the word transcultural, we transit from our own culture to the other culture and then explore it from within. But I think that these three different connotations are not in mutual contradiction anyway. They just enrich the meaning of the transcultural, of the notion of transcultural research. Just to sum it up again, the ontological assumption underlying the concept of culture does not necessarily refer in transcultural research to a metaphysics of an abstract substantial being, but is rather connected to a concept of culture understood as being based on a metaphysics of relation. Because if we, of course, surpass this outdated static form mode of culture, this does not mean that there is no culture. Of course, there is still a culture. Cultures still exist. There are concrete things like concrete languages, but both are changeable entities that are developing through history and that are also changing with history. So what do I mean when I say the metaphysics of relations? What kind of relations is that constitutes this concept of culture? Well, it is a relation between different elements that constitute different crucial elements that constitute what we are accustomed to understand under an entity of culture. So these are, for instance, historical developments, then specific economic systems, the underlying framework of institutions, beliefs, languages, and linguistic structures, and so on. So this is a metaphysics of relations which underlies this new dynamic understanding of culture. So, and on this basis, we can return now to our basic question, namely how to transfer meanings from one sociocultural into another, how to, let's say, modernize this outdated concept of intercultural research, because this is not a very easy question, because, as we all know, concepts and categories cannot be simply and one-dimensionally or directly transferred from one culture into another. What we have to take into account in this very process is what I call frameworks of reference that underlie actually every theory. It is not that different theories would be embedded in different cultures, would produce different frameworks of reference. In fact, the problems linked to the concept of referential frameworks is something that can be also, that can occur, that is occurring all the time in one and the same culture. Also, because every theory is embedded into a framework of reference. For instance, if we just, Feng Yaoming, who was working on this issue also a lot, the analytical philosopher from Hong Kong, but from a different perspective, has said in this concept, let us remind of the theories of Einstein and Newton, on their theories of physics. They were also written in the same language, and they even worked with very same concepts, but these concepts, because of the referential frameworks, were different, so these concepts had a completely different meaning. So what I call the framework of reference, Thomas Kuhn, for instance, because many Western theorists or philosophers of science have also been dealing with those questions, for instance, Kuhn, Quinn, Lakatos, even Feyerabend, and so on. And what I call framework of reference, for instance, Thomas Kuhn calls a paradigm. I think that in this regard, the term paradigm is a little bit too broad, because we all know paradigm means actually a crucial underlying pattern of something within of meanings within a theory. But notwithstanding the differences in names, what I mean is actually very similar to what Thomas Kuhn has referred to in his very famous book on the structure of scientific revolutions. And here we can see actually how a paradigm shift, when the moment when, or the moment, it is of course a process, when one theoretical discourse is being replaced with another in science, how this affects the basic worldviews of people living in the culture that in which these theories have arisen. So, of course, we have seen that framework of references occur everywhere where theories are developed, also in one and the same culture. But different cultures, of course, also necessarily produce different frameworks of reference, because they are linked to different languages, to the different grammatical structures of these languages. They are also, I mean, the more two cultural linguistic spheres or regions have been developed in mutual isolation, the more they are historically apart, the more their political, economic, institutional system differs from each other, the more the linguistic structures of them were developed separately in mutual separation, the greater is the possibilities that they will produce very different frameworks of reference in their theory. So what is actually a framework of reference? It is an open, dynamic network. Actually, we cannot picture it as a kind of closet with, you know, very fixed boundaries, with something that is, it is open, in my view, it is open and it is dynamic. It is also changeable because language and thought is changing all the time. So they define, these are networks, dynamic networks, that define every concept applied in a certain theory, and also defines their specific meanings, their specific connotations, right? So, and in the same way, they define the relation between individual different concepts, the relations between them, and also the network as such. So everything is, of course, connected to everything else. Yeah, and this is... Yeah. For instance, I have mentioned Feng Yaoming from Hong Kong just a few minutes before, and that he was also in his younger years dealing with this framework of reference, also, although he called it premise frameworks, but it doesn't matter. Well, what he wanted to point out in his elaboration on these frameworks is the fact that, you see, these frameworks of reference, these frameworks are so different from each other regarding Western and Chinese philosophy that there is an incommensurability between them. So they cannot be compared to each other. And of course, I do not agree with, I strongly and respectfully disagree with this opinion, because I think, of course, Western and Chinese philosophies can be compared, and it is also very meaningful for us to do this. I have to hold this opinion, otherwise I would be unemployed. I think this is what I do, right? But I am convinced that this the mastering, the knowledge of, you know, referential frameworks, of main referential frameworks and the underlying paradigms of the cultures we are dealing with is very important, because then they are not actually boundaries that divide us, but are possible bridges. There are strong tools who can help us understand the other culture, because they also, if you know the underlying paradigms, that we can see that they also that they are kind of filters that filter what we perceive subjectively from the external reality also. So they can lead, different framework of reference can also lead to different descriptions of one and the same reality. And the knowledge of this, of basic features, of basic characteristic features of each framework of reference enables us to implement what I call discursive translations. These are interpretations of a foreign culture that is not only, of course, literary translation, but also involves the discursive, the theoretical, the referential background of the philosophy or idea we are dealing with. Okay. So, and on this basis, we shall now proceed to the question of the problems of the so-called comparative philosophy, right? There have been many controversies recently linked to this, to the problems that are actually part of the basic theoretical model of comparison, right? We have, of course, in a classical model of comparative, we have two objects that we are, or more objects that we are comparing. These are comparata. And then we have the criteria or also the similarities on the basis of which we can establish this comparison, and this is called tertium comparationis. And many scholars think that the main problem of the traditional comparative philosophies is, or models, comparative models, is linked to the fact that we have one and the same methodology, we have one and the same philosophical language, which we apply then on culturally diverse material. But I think that this problem goes further. It is not that easy. It is not that simple, because this unified methodology, this unified philosophical language and terminology, this is actually part of one of the two comparata. This is the main problem. So it is impossible when we compare Western and Chinese philosophies, for instance. This is always the Western methodology, the Western evaluation criteria, the Western norms and standards that are actually being used as tertium comparationis, that should actually be an external criteria, something that could, a criteria, a norm that could enable an objective proceeding of this comparison. But this is still not being the same, the case. We are still confronted with many Eurocentric and Orientalist elements in today's intercultural, transcultural research. This is, of course, due to the relicts of colonialism, because some maybe people could say, what is actually how can you still talk about Eurocentrism if you see how unimportant has Europe become in the last years? There cannot be. Why should Europe still provide these standards of evaluation? I mean, this is ridiculous, right? But it is, of course, the problem is that we are living in a globalized world, and this globalization was developed on a basis of modernization, which was imported from Europe. And through the spread of this colonial modernization, these standards and norms have been spread worldwide, and that's why they are still in effect, in my view. So how now to solve this? So how can we solve these questions now? Well, many scholars have recently, including some that are sitting here among us today, have provided or tried to develop new approaches, new methods that could somehow resolve or go beyond or surpass these problems that I was talking about in this first half of my talk. They have many common threads. First common thread is that most of them don't want to use comparative philosophy just as a means to, to getting to a better interpretation of some philosopher, or to identify similarities and differences between two comparata. They want to go further, and they want to use these two or more comparata as inspirations for their own philosophizing. This is the first thing that connects most of them. The second one is that they are based upon procedures of conceptual comparing instead of merely comparing concepts, because we have seen why comparing concepts is, of course, problematic, because concepts are not fixed entities with fixed meaning, but they change with time and history. Three most influential methods that have been developed in this among these new discourses are called philosophy of fusion, philosophy of synthesis, and philosophy of confluence. They all of them have brought about many new ideas, but I also have that each of them has a certain shortcomings because nothing is perfect. But because of the time limitations, I will not, I cannot go into very detailed critiques of these three methods. I can only show you these nice pictures of these three methods, how I see them. Okay. Philosophy of confluence. And now instead, let's focus on the method I'm trying to develop during the recent years and the application of which I have also tried to show last year at Macau University at this department in my lecture. And now I would like to talk with you in a more general sense. What is actually this method of sublation? What is it about? It is a method that helps me very much in my style of work. It helps me thinking, it helps me developing my own approaches. And at the same time, I think it is a suitable method to overcoming the problems we were just discussing. But it is, of course, I have to point out that in the very beginning that you will still be allowed to use other methods. It will not be obligatory from now on to use this method of sublation in intercultural comparisons. But it is, as I said, it is something that helps me in my own individual research. And it is also something that could be at least partly used maybe by other scholars who work in similar ways than I do. So the method of sublation is actually a form of a dialectical method of comparison, but not a Hegelian dialectics. It has nothing to do with the Hegelian dialectics, which is based on two comparata or two theses. Later on, Fichte, I think, has brought about this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. These were not Hegel's words. But what is important is that these so-called thesis and antithesis are based on the three principles of formal logic, which means that thesis and antithesis, or the two comparanta, would be in mutual contradiction, not only opposition, but contradiction, which also means that they would exclude each other. And this is not like that in this method of sublation, because the method of sublation is a dialectical model that is somehow closer to the traditional Chinese dialectics of correlative complementarity. And it also, Hegel's model also produces a static synthesis, which is a new, qualitatively different, separate phase of comparison or of dialectical, the dialectical process. There is no synthesis in the method of sublation, but there is the crucial phase of this method, which is proceeding in eight accumulating phases, is the phase of sublation, which represents a shift of our thought that brings us to a new idea. So, but if I said that this dialectical method is actually, this dialectical comparison is actually very different from the Hegelian method of dialectics, many people have asked me, but why you then call it sublation? Because everybody, you just say sublation and everybody thinks about Hegel, right? But I think that in Hegel's system, the method of sublation was not even one of these three crucial points that constitute the framework of these dialectics. But what is important here is that the term sublation, which has been constituted as a neologism by some translators of Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit, have some of these translators, that they have been looking for a suitable word, for a suitable term to translate Hegel's Aufhebung, which is a German term that has three meanings, three connotations: eliminating, preserving, and rising to a new higher level. So they could not find a word like this in English language, and that's why, like so often before, they have looked to the Latin language, and they found this verb sublatio, which also entails all these three crucial connotations of Hegel's word, of Hegel's term Aufhebung. So they just made a noun out of it, and now sublation is Aufhebung. And I think that this sublation, these three connotations that are included in the concept of Aufhebung or of sublation, are very crucial in the process of applying the method I try to develop. So in these three connotations, against are eliminating, preserving, and rising to a new level. We eliminate some elements of both comparata. We preserve other elements from both comparata, and this leads us to a kind of shift in our thinking, which can lead to a new insight, which can illuminate new fields of future research, for instance, or they can simply give us a new understanding of the research question from which we were proceeding, actually, in our comparison. So this is a outdated schema of the sublation method. Of course, it is only consisting of 7 phases here, but now there are 8 already. But what is here very important to see is that this sublation is a product of attention between the two comparata, and it leads us to a shift in our thinking. So in its final form, the method of sublation consists of 8 distinct phases, which are not, I mean, the borderlines between them are not as fixed as it is shown here in this schematic representation. They go one into another, of course, very often, and there is a processual proceeding from one phase into the other. Cheers. So I will try to introduce very briefly what is happening in these 8 phases, right? So first we proceed from a research question. This question must be connected to something we are interested in. We are very curious about a philosophical idea that doesn't let us sleep at night, or something like that, right? And then we formulate a research question, but this research question has to be formulated in a relational way, because this enables us to implement conceptual comparisons instead of remaining limited to comparisons of concepts, which is problematic, as we have seen. Then we choose, of course, 2 comparata, 2 philosophical ideas, 2 philosophies, 2 systems, 2 ideologies, 2 theories, whatever, which deal with this same research question, each in a particular way. Then the next phase is the phase 2, sublation phase 2. We point out the similarities in these two comparata, because similarities are usually quite easy to find. The next phase is we identify differences between them, but not differences between the two comparata as such, but differences that can be identified within these similarities we have just identified. Because, as I said, it is quite easy to find some similarities, but as we go deeper into as we study deeper, how did these philosopher come to this resolving of this view of this research question, then we see, wow, there are so many differences actually, and these similarities are actually quite superficial, right? And so so now we have these differences, and now what? So we try to connect these differences to the specific referential frameworks that underlie both theories under observation. This, of course, preconditions that we know this referential framework we are and the underlying paradigms we are dealing with. Okay, and then when we link these differences to different particular referential frameworks, we can easier identify insufficiencies of both comparata, because we can always find, I have made a lot of these different examples of how to work with this. We can always find some insufficiencies in both comparata. We can say, oh, but this one overlooked this, and this one just ignored this, and he couldn't see this because of the referential frame, and so on. So we identify insufficiencies. Then in the next phase, we just eliminate these insufficiencies that they are not constructive for our work, but we proceed to the sublation phase 6, where we try to establish a mutual complementarity between the two comparata, which means that the insufficiencies of both comparata can be, we look if they can be complemented by each one by the other one, right? Then in these 7 phases, actually the tension, some kind of tension between the two comparata is increasing. We have to hold in our mind more and more different elements of these two comparata. This is really a tension, and then you have to go swimming. And then after that, this is the preparation of the sublation phase 7. And then suddenly there is a shift in your thinking, and you see some new insight, you see some new idea, you see some new possibilities of further research, at least. Normally you see something new, and this is the concluding phase, the sublation phase 8, which represents the happy ending of the entire method. So, yeah. You see, I have just concluded my book on this method, on which I have been working in the recent years. And the book consists of 2 parts. In the first part, I explained this method and its theoretical backgrounds, and its how it is, how it works, and which problems, that is one, basically all this stuff that I have been talking now, but in a more elaborate way. This is the first part of the book, and in the second part, I demonstrate the working of this sublation method on 7 different examples. And when I was writing this book, I also thought that this way of proceeding was a very, very nice way of proceeding, because with each demonstration, I could somehow improve the theoretical model as such, and vice versa. When the theoretical model was improved, then the next demonstration was somehow better, and it went more fluently. The only problem is that these demonstrations are getting longer and longer through the book. I think the first one is about 30 pages and the last one about 60 or something like that. But this is, yeah, I have to think about how to solve this question. So, and just to get you an idea how these 7 demonstrations, what they are about. As you can see, they are all based on a certain research question that is relational, right? In the first case, we have the relation between the empirical and the transcendental. Then we have the relation between the subject and object of comprehension. Then we have a relation between concepts and realities. Then we have in which, this is the example I have been introducing here last year, Rošker and Jana, and the problem of the flying arrow. Of course, here there is also a relational question. It is about the question about the relation of movement and stillstand in time and space, of course. Then in the next example about Russell and the Jiangdongsun, it is the main question is the question about not about the relation between reality and our perception of reality per se, but more what makes this relation possible. What is in both structural epistemologies actually the thing that enables compatibility between the human mind and the external realities. Then the next example was made because I wanted to show that you can do this comparison, of course, comparisons also within one and the same culture. So I think that the Sinic or East Asian cultural space is also somehow, it has some common cultural ground. So the next one was Nishida Kitaro and Mozung-san. And the last and the longest example is I wanted to show that it is not only, for instance, you can do this with very short ideas, flying arrow problem. This is very short and simple, but you can also, I have also tried to do it, and I think it is possible to do it with very large, with very large entities or systems of thought like individualism and relationism. So the last example is about sublating social ideologies, individualism and relationalism. I have forgotten to point to, before I conclude, I will conclude in 3 minutes. One important difference between the Hegelian dialectics and this kind of sublation dialectics is also that the Hegelian dialectics proceeds from in accordance with specific rational laws, and it is actually proceeding more or less automatically, whereas in the sublation method, the role of human subjectivity, of our subjectivity, including all our errors and misconceptions and everything, but it is a method that tries to preserve also this personal autonomy in doing philosophy, including including comparative transcultural philosophy. And now I think it's time for me to shut up and to open the space for your questions, comments, and remarks. And yeah, thank you all very much for your patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as per usual, I'm going to try and establish a queue here. I'm going to try and balance between those present in the room and anybody who on Zoom who may also wish to ask a question. So those of you listening from Zoom, do feel free to put a question into the chat, and I'm going to maybe just sort of alternate back and forth between present and online. So let's begin setting up the queue for this room then. Okay. Hands up for a moment, if you could. Okay, how about you go first, Ellen? I can, hand this over to you. Well, you're going to need one.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Jana, for addressing this really important issue in terms of methodology in comparative studies, comparative philosophy. So myself being engaged that for so many years, and as you realize that facing a lot of problem in that, and love this sublational phases you talk about here. But I was wondering whether you are still a bit too optimistic here to talking about the possibility of trying not to use one dominant, framework of reference, and in the process of a comparison, like me doing Chinese and Western, and I'm using English language. Sometimes very difficult for me to say not using the framework of reference in Western philosophy to talk about the Chinese philosophy. I realize that problem. And I feel it's very difficult to avoid that kind of thing, particularly, if I'm addressing audience, in the English speaking world. And there's only one occasion I'm using the framework of the reference and dealing with Nagarjuna's concept of language and truth claim, and using the Nagarjuna's framework to talk about Nietzsche's understanding about truth claim. That's the only thing that I try to reverse, but I'm still using one framework to talk about the other here. So that's my first question. Second is that also the problem of incommensurability. In comparison, I know you talk about insufficiency, but still, how do you deal with the problem of incommensurability? And you realize that indeficiency, but how really you resolve that problem? My last question is: are you familiar with the work by Steve? What's the name? Steve Burrick, who has a book called "The End of Comparative Philosophy" and "The Task of Comparative Thinking." Yeah, it looked like he tried. I mean, he's addressing the similar issue that you talk about here, but in his work, he still trying to talk about Taoism, basic on the concept of some concept of thought from Heidegger and Derrida. So for me, still, it's not like what do you try to do here? It's still like he addressing the problem, but still, in a sense, still he's in the trap of the problem he's addressing here. So back to you. So do you think this what your model of sublation would resolve this kind of problem, as you just illustrated? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ellie. Yeah, of course. Regarding your first question, I'm too optimistic as always, but on the other hand, where would we be without optimism, right? It is a kind of generative power, I think, of our world. And regarding the frameworks of reference, I'm very well aware of the problem you were pointing out, that it is in a sense, I also think that these frameworks can be conceived as methodologically too essentialistic somehow. You know, we want to deduce a very bright complexity of a cultural reality to some framework. This is never good. This can never be good, right? But as I said, first of all, I see these frameworks and I try to use them as a kind of tool which brings us closer. And I think the magic word is in this regard is precisely what I mentioned already. These are not closed frameworks, but a very open network. On the other hand, I think that this question you have raised, it is a very general and very elementary problem of how do we conceptualize, mediate, and interpret reality in an academic, systematic way, right? Because if you want to do it, and actually it goes further even to the most basic modes of how we use language, we have to categorize reality in some way, right? So there is always this problem that I feel is also being trapped between, you know, the scala of a very rigid methodology and the charybdis of conceptualizing and talking about communicating reality in any way. So I don't think that this method can solve this question. I don't think that any method can solve this question. So when I speak about this method and in general, and also these frameworks in particular, I'm merely speaking of tools, not of some magic, you know, power that could resolve this. This question cannot be resolved actually. Then your second question was, if I remember correctly, also connected to the question of incommensurability. Probably I didn't make myself very clear in this lecture in many places, because it is very open to misunderstandings. What I said, but I do not believe in that the two cultures are, any two cultures are incompatible. I do believe that there are differences, there are similarities between us living in different cultures, right? And I think that the similarities outweigh the differences by far. We are all human beings, no matter of in which culture we are raised and socialized, no matter of what color is or skin or brain is structured in the same way, or feelings or elementary feelings are the same. And these are actually, you know, these paths on which we can establish this mutual commensurability. No matter of how different the cultures are in which we were raised. We are all human beings, and this is the main thing. Steve Burek and his new proposed method, as I don't see it actually in any contradiction with the method of sublation. As I said, it is an approach which is suitable. I mean, we work individual in different ways, and this is of course very good, because diversity is what we need more than anything else in this world today, which is increasingly unified by its economic foundations. I don't think that these two methods, I mean, the method that Steve Burek is doing, or even the method of fusion philosophy that Ralph Weber wants to use, or the method of confluence that has been developed in Vienna in the intercultural philosophy, that these methods are in mutual contradiction. I think I can also borrow in my work. I mean, I will not from now on focus, you know, exclusively only on this sublation. I will, of course, also learn from other approaches, from other scholars. I will continue to integrate their insight into my research. And in any way, I don't see it actually in such mutual, not only contradiction, but also distance from each other. I think they should work together also. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, if you could pass the mic to Victoria, but before we get to you, I'll do as I said, and I do have a question here. It's being typed into the chat, so I'll just read it to you verbatim. Okay, the message reads, "Thanks for your sharing, Professor. It's very interesting. Could you introduce one or two findings or conclusions concerning the idea of culture and identity in your transcultural research?" And a second question here, "How do people recognize their bi-identity or trans identity and find peace in life in the context of globalization?" Might be a hard question, that second one.
Yeah, these are very, very hard questions, which are also very difficult to answer in the framework of one such brief discussion. But when I start with the first one, I would just like to say, if we go back, for instance, to the previous slide, the insights or the results of what I've been doing with this sublation-related exchange are the outcomes of these seven examples, and I would try to reply to this question with a brief but very sincere request to read my book. Please do it. Because I mean, I could go through these 7 examples now and but then I mean this would swallow the whole remaining time for the discussion. Regarding the second question, it is a very important question, and of course it is somehow food of thought to ask ourselves, in what way are transcultural, for instance, transcultural issues related to transgender studies, for instance, in this globalized world. Of course, they are connected as in the completely the same way. The transcultural approach aims to transcend the static understanding of culture. The transgender approach aims to transcend static connotations of gender, and it's all in both approaches are of course connected to certain implications and have a very actually a very strong political connotation. But yeah, I see them as very tightly connected to each other. So thank you very much for this question.
Okay, I have a couple of questions, but I'll just give you one for now to give others a chance. So it's regarding the 8-step procedure. I wasn't quite sure about the first step and the 8th step. The way that I heard it, which may not be quite right, is that step 1 is you find your question, and yeah, so you find your question, and is step 2 where you locate your traditions that you want to investigate the question with respect to, or that's already okay. Yeah, I see. So the cross-cultural, yeah, the cross-cultural dimension is already built into the first step. So then I think I know the answer to the other part of this question, which is the 8th step. Is this an answer to the question or a response to the question that is independent of the two cultural frameworks or transferable out of them? Or is it intrinsically embedded in the two frameworks somehow?
Thank you. No, the 8th step actually is, in a certain sense, it is a reply to the research question, because it furnishes us with new insight. I mean, it is not a resolving of most of the research questions there, as you could see, could not been really resolved. They are, most of them belong to these eternal philosophical questions that will torture us all the nights for the rest of our nights. It is not about finding a final answer, and this is also the 8th phase of the sublation process, is also not the final answer to the research question, but it is one of the possible resolutions, or one of the, usually in these 7 examples I have where I have applied the method, it ended in a phase where I could illuminate a new dimension that is connected to this question. It is never a reply, a final reply, because this is impossible. But you can see it from different viewpoints. You can see it from in different light, in different perspective. You can see something new connected to this research question, which has not been researched before. And in some of these examples, what came out was also a straight line of, wow, this comparison has helped me to see that there is a very important new field that has to be further researched in this regard. So I hope I have replied to your at least elementary satisfaction. Or okay.
We have a very brief follow-up from the previous Zoom participant, which is just a request to remind them of the title of your forthcoming book, so they can buy several copies, no doubt.
Okay, because he or she has to read it.
Yes.
Okay, the book is now in the proofreading process. But I have sent the manuscript to Bloomsbury, so it is it has to go through the review process, of course, but there is a big chance that it will be published by Bloomsbury. And the title, I'm still thinking about it. The title now is Sublating Chinese Philosophy, Epistemic Encounters in Transcultural Context. But it might change. If the person is, I write my books and articles like most of other scholars in order to be read. I don't want to write them for myself, right? I'm always happy if people are reading my work, but they must not buy it. I don't have anything of it if they buy it. I prefer that they find it in libraries or somewhere else. And if this person is genuinely interested in reading my book, I can send them the PDF manuscript. I will be glad to do so, but it will probably still be changed a little bit because it has to go through a review process. Okay.
Nevia.
Thank you, Jana. A lot of interesting topics, not just a presentation of a model. So as you were presenting the methodology, I couldn't but think of Umberto Eco's Lector in Fabula. So if I had to, now offer a title to your book, I would call it Lector in Fabule, right? So I would like to know how wrong I am in thinking of your model as actually a theory of interpretation that is specifically applied to scholars in comparative philosophy. And this notion of framework of references, to me, actually evoking the notion of encyclopedia from, this interpretative method of Umberto Eco. So this is just an impression that I had, that actually the main point here is to offer a model of interpretation. Am I so wrong? So you're trying to basically offer a guidance or some kind of borders, boundaries, and the principles for interpretation. And if that is the case, I find that this model has a lot of similarities with Umberto's model of interpretation.
Thank you very much. It feels like an immense honor to be compared with Umberto Eco, really. That was not my intention, but of course, the sublation method is about interpretation. It is to a great extent a theory of interpretation. It has to do, like the title of my recent book says, Interpreting Chinese Philosophy. It is also working with trying to find suitable modes of interpretation for us Western scholars who are dealing with Chinese philosophy. This was the main motivation of this book, Interpreting Chinese Philosophy, for me. And it is also the main motivation behind working on this sublation project. But actually, it is not only a theory of interpretation. I think theory of interpretation is a very important part of it, but it is not actually everything. So it is not a theory in a sense of a hermeneutics, because there are several insufficiencies in this regard when we think about it as a kind of hermeneutics. And I have been developing these insufficiencies in another segment of my research work, which starts with the critique of Gadamer's fusion of horizons, because I think, and I try to show in this research also, why it is still too conceptual and too based on too fixed notion of a concept. Right, and I try to develop some less conceptual and more dynamic forms of interpretation, but separately from this sublation method. And I have not come very far in this regard, only to one paper actually, which is based on the suggestion that the Gadamer's fusion of horizons horizons method could be replaced, at least for interpreting some kind of Chinese philosophical works, especially Taoism, with a method that I call fusion of Jingjias, fusion of aesthetic realms, which is a kind of a less conceptual method. But yeah, of course, interpretation is also one of the basic motivations behind the development of this method. So thank you for this question.
Okay, thank you very much, Jana. Very good to see you here. Yeah, and it's very interesting and also very huge project that you have done right now. And I have two questions. And the first question, maybe already you answered. I know that you want to develop a methodology of comparative philosophy. I want you to compare your method of this sublation with Gadamer's fusion of horizon. Yeah, because it looks like you're on the same way. And maybe we could discuss more in detail about it. But second question related to your 8 steps of the methodology, let's say the methodology of sublation. Let's go back to that. My question would be like this. Is that necessary to follow all these 8 steps? Or we could choose any steps? And for example, like French sinologist Julien, he will see that the difference might be more important. Let's see, can we go from the 3rd step and then to the 8? We get new idea just based on the difference. We don't need to go to this kind of identifying insufficiency or complementary or mutual complementary. All these kind of things, we got just to go directly from 3rd to the 8, or from the 2nd, similarity. We just find similarities and go get some ideas. Yeah, if that is the case, why we need 8 steps? Yeah, and in what way we call the 8 steps? Yeah, and of course, we can also compare it with Hegel, because the concept of sublation has some connotation of Hegel. Yeah, Hegel, of course, we have specific steps, so we cannot, avoid it. But in your case, if we can go directly from 3rd or 2nd to the 8, and why we need 8. Yeah, thanks.
I can calm you down, my dear friend, immediately. You don't need 8. You can only use 1 or 2. It's up to you. You will not be prosecuted. No, but okay, that was a joke. I will start with your end. I was talking about this last question regarding Hegel about 15 minutes, but when I finished, then you came in. So you just missed that part, but I'm aware of the issue, and I was talking a lot about it in this lecture. So I'm not going to repeat that again. Otherwise, everybody is going to fall asleep. And regarding the first question, it is my great desire to be able someday, to connect these 2 things, the method of sublation, which also has, among other things, this interpretative function, and what I'm doing with the critique of Gadamer, and developing this other hermeneutics of the fusion of Jingjias. But I don't think that I can do it very soon, in a very near future. I hope to live long enough to bring them together. Then back to these 8 steps. I think the 8 steps are, of course, they are not necessary. I have also pointed out that, but you were not here at that part, that these steps can also be reduced. It is not, I mean, these 8 steps are actually, they are only there because of the Buddhist 8 steps of revelation, you know. No, this was also a stupid joke, but these 8 steps, they suit to my way of thinking and working. They not necessarily suit to you or to him or to her, you know. It is a dialectical method which is different from the dialectical method of model of Hegel, but how you proceed concretely with these different dialectical methods, I mean, you can have 3 phases, you can have 5 phases, you can have only 2 if you want. But for me, the 8 phases were helpful because if each of them has added another dimension to the problem I was working on. And this multidimensional, the more multidimensional this whole issue became, the greater was the tension that helped me to this sublation shift. But yeah, but you are allowed to reduce it to 3 or 4 or even 2 phases. Thank you. Thank you.
On a comparative philosophy project between, well, the use of humor as a philosophical tool between Zhuangzi and Nietzsche. So this is very enriching for me, but my question is precisely about the use of sublation and the terms you used in Chinese language, Yangqi. Because I just Googled the term and at least Pleco shows it can be translated as develop what is useful or healthy and discard what is not. And this reminded me of some maybe not that academic thing from martial artist Bruce Lee, who was a reader of Hegel, and he used this exact definition for his martial art. Like, you have to always try to perfect what you're good at and take off what is not good or comfortable or efficient in the way you approach martial arts. So I was wondering if you could go deeper into this definition of Yangqi. Maybe it will work for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And first, a question back. Couldn't you find a more complicated topic than the comparison of humor? Actually, this is a thing I wanted to do initially for my dissertation, and then I dropped it very soon because I mean, humor is really the most difficult thing because of its subtleness also, among other issues. Yeah, but back to your main question, of course, sublation, Yangqi is the official philosophical translation for the term Aufhebung of Hegel. It is not my fault. It is also not, I mean, I also feel compelled to, you know, to make it better, to improve it, to suggest another translation. It is not an ideal one. But anyway, I also feel very, very honored to be compared to Bruce Lee. So thank you. Today I've been compared to Umberto Eco and then to Bruce Lee. Wow. I'm really very honored. But yeah. But regarding his theory of martial arts, just, you know, that concentrating on these 2 parts of, you know, just just eliminating the things you are not good and preserving the ones you are brilliant in and developing them to become even more brilliant. I don't see it, in such an absolute way, because life is also changeable, and maybe now you are very bad in doing something, but in 2 years you will be outstanding in doing these things. So when I applied this sublation, it is also, I try not to apply it in such in such an absolutistic way. We just throw this away and forget about it, and then we will only concentrate on these healthy issues. Healthy is, by the way, a word I really cannot stand in the philosophical connotation, because it is very dangerous. And yeah, anyway, I think it is better to see it in a more relativistic way, with not so absolute, putting away with this and just preserving that. But thank you for comparing me to Bruce Lee. I'm so happy about it. Yeah, there might be. I mean, he's so deeply ingrained into